Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Just me tonight. Aaron is off out in the Colorado Rockies doing some sort of important work stuff or whatever he's doing. So tonight we're going to kind of continue what we've been doing for a bunch of shows here and there, talking about communities and community managers, and we've been very lucky to have a bunch of really good community managers, especially around open source projects over the years. So folks like Mark Hinkle and Sarah Novotny and Robin Bergeron and a whole bunch of others. And tonight we're very lucky to have yet another really, really good community manager and somebody who's unbelievably passionate about open source and communities and stuff. So excited to have Nathen Harvey on with us. Nathen, community manager for Chef. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much, Brian. It's awesome to be here. We should also say, Nathen, a lot of folks we have on the show, regular jobs, they do what they do. They come on the podcast. They're always a little bit nervous. Nathen runs one of the really, really good podcasts that's out there. Very DevOps focused. He's been doing it for a long time. So if you want to dive into some of the DevOps stuff, which I know a lot of you guys do, go check out his podcast, Food Fight Show. Does an awesome job. They get really into stuff, a lot of hands-on things, a lot of what's going on in the real world. So that one's excellent. So how are you, man? Where are you today? Because I know you're always traveling around.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm coming to you from the amazing, brilliant Food Fight Show studios, which is my home office in Annapolis, Maryland.
There you go.
Yeah. And thanks for the kind words about the Food Fight Show. You said it's a really good one. I would only caveat that with it's a really good amateur podcast, because I never want to set the bar too high. It's totally an amateur podcast. It is a lot of fun, though.
Yeah, no, it's good, and people love coming on the show and stuff. So, tell us about your background, because anybody who does community management, one of the first things is you've got to have some level of credibility to be talking about the stuff you're doing. Tell folks about your background, kind of how it's evolved, and how you've gotten to what you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. So my background, I started off, if we go back, I don't know, more years than I care to say out loud. I was working at a large enterprise software company. Actually, it was a small startup software company that got purchased by a large enterprise software company. And while I was there, I was actually working in the internal IT department. But my job there was basically building applications. In fact, I was in charge of building out and managing our customer and partner support extranet. And the mere fact that I called it an extranet just now kind of dates it. Like exactly. What even is an extranet? For you younger folks out there that are listening, an extranet is this. It's a website that's available on the internet, but you have to log in to get to it. It's weird. So in any case, I was working there. It got purchased by a large software company that was a German-based software company, and it really changed the culture and my role within that organization. So I actually left there and went over to sales operations of all places. But the reason I went to sales operations was because I saw what we were doing was we were replacing our big Siebel implementation with a Salesforce.com implementation. And I saw the real value in not managing my own services, not managing my own software, and this whole idea of just making the business and the people using the software more successful, switching over to Salesforce.com was really, really appealing to me. And so it was at that point that I decided to leave this big company and go become a Salesforce.com consultant. But before I did that, I called up my old boss and asked for a reference. And he said, yes, sure, of course, I'll give you a reference. But I just started at this venture-backed startup, so I want you to come in here and interview first. I want right of first refusal. If you don't want this job, then I'll totally give you a good reference.
There you go.
And it was awesome because it was a venture-backed stealth startup, and I ended up getting the job there. I was hired as the director of customer support. But, I just said some key words there. It was a stealth startup. Brian, one thing a stealth startup doesn't have?
Customers?
Exactly. And I was the director of customer support. So think about this. This is the best customer support job ever. If you think about most customer support folks, they get called when things are bad. You don't usually call up the customer support department and be like, hey, man, your stuff is working great today. I just wanted to thank you. That never happens. So for me, it was awesome. I was going to run customer support, and no one was ever going to call me, at least not until we launched our product. But unfortunately for me, that lasted about 3 days, in which the CEO came into my office, and by that I mean like he turned his swivel chair and looked at me and said, "Hey Nathan, those guys that helped build the prototype that got us funding that allowed us to hire a director of customer support." I said, "Yeah, those guys are cool." He said, "Yeah, we just fired those guys because I don't really like them." And he saw the look of dread on my face, and he said, "No, don't worry. We've hired in a consultancy to finish building out the app. But we're going live in 6 weeks, so all we need you to do is build us a production infrastructure because, you're the most senior technical person on staff now." So then I turned white as a ghost, but at that very moment, I became a sysadmin. And I think it's odd for someone to remember the exact moment when they became a sysadmin or when they became a real engineer. Like, that was my moment. It was my moment to shine. And
so you just swiped your credit card and spun up some Amazon instances and you were good to go, right?
It was crazy because that's kind of what I did. And at the big software company, it literally had taken me 18 months from the time I said, "I want a new server, here's the form filled out," to the time I was able to log into a server. And at this new startup, like, it was a brave new world. It took like 10 minutes max for me to like fill out a form. And next thing I knew, I had root access on a box that I would never see, that I would never touch. I also was the best sysadmin ever. The reason I knew I was the best sysadmin ever was because every command I typed into my shell, before I hit the enter key, I would copy that command and paste it into a wiki. That way I could always repeat whatever I did. And that's how I knew, like, I was totally safe. I could always just rebuild my infrastructure from scratch anytime I needed to. Of course, what I didn't realize was that the minute I hit save, that wiki became the obituary for what my infrastructure used to look like. Because I don't know about you, Brian, but it's tough to maintain documentation and keep things fully up to date with what's actually happening in the real world.
Yep, absolutely.
So someone came to me, a guy who was actually mentoring me, and he said, "Hey, there's this thing called Puppet. There's this other thing called Chef, and they automate most of the work that you do." And I looked him dead in the eye, and I said to him, I said, "Tom, I am far too busy to automate. Leave me alone."
Yep.
Which, of course, I laugh at today, but it was totally the real thing. So a couple years later, I left that company. I went and was running web infrastructure at another company that was in a data center. We were migrating to the cloud. We had adopted infrastructure as code. And from there, I started using Chef. I started hosting meetup groups. I found my way onto the Food Fight show. And so within, a year or two, it became obvious to me that my real passion was helping others in the community adopt open source, adopt infrastructure as code, adopt this new crazy thing called DevOps. And so I was doing that nights and weekends, and I decided that what I could do is maybe get paid to do that and spend my nights and weekends with my family, which to me sounded so much better. And so that's how I landed at Chef.
Very cool. Very cool story. No, it's interesting, especially I hear about more and more people. I talk to more people that, they think, okay, if I see certain people that are doing these things, the jobs look kind of cool, or the skill set they have, they must have learned over, years and years and years. And I keep trying to come back to them. I'm like, the way things are now, there's so much that's online, so you can learn everything. There's meetups every night if you want to pick people's brains. And if you're doing it every day, like, you can get really smart about a lot of this stuff. Like, I don't know. I hate to poo-poo like people that have been doing this stuff for years and years, but I mean, like, you can get pretty smart and authoritative, at least on certain things, like in a year, 6 months, sometimes 18 months. And if you're involved with the communities, like, you're immersed in this stuff. Like, people want to help you. They want to teach you as much as you're trying to connect them and all that stuff. So it's like, that story you told is sort of like the fabric of these things I keep telling people about. Just get involved, start working on something, and you'll be amazed at like how fast your learning curve goes if you put in some time on it, put in a few nights and stuff like that.
That's absolutely the case. I mean, I love every engineer with a comp sci degree. I do not have a comp sci degree. But I did, the minute I found, and for me, coming to open source started through Ruby on Rails, actually, because that was the framework that we were building in at that startup. But through Rails and then into Chef, I found this community of people out there in the world, people that had never met me, could never put a face to the name, but who were willing to help. They were sharing code. They were helping me become better. And from that point on, like, all I've ever wanted to do is give back and make that journey easy for someone else.
Yep. Now, I want to throw something out. I want to try and see if I'm on track here. So, we've had Michael Ducy on the show. He's a friend of the show. We listen to his podcast. We listen to your podcast. One of the things I've noticed, and his podcast focuses on it a ton, but I'm seeing it more and more of people that work at Chef, whether it's at like Velocity Conf or just one of the other meetups or something. Like, it feels like Chef is spending a lot of time sort of embedding themselves with whether they're customers today or they're just customers that are going like, I know I've got to start not only using more modern applications, build modern applications, but do DevOps. Like, is that something that sort of organically happened where they just said, you guys deal with this a lot, can you come help us? Or is that an active thing you felt like you needed to get even closer and embed yourself with customers and help them do their own internal DevOps days? And is that a sort of a I don't know, big push going on at Chef these days?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really a combination of the two. I think, frankly, if you ask people at Chef, we will be the first ones to tell you that yes, there is a technology gap. Like, you have to move to a place where you're able to automate all of your infrastructure. You can manage your infrastructure as code, because what you want to do is build a higher velocity organization where you're shipping out code more frequently and safely. But we all know that it's a myth to think that what you can do is just throw a tool at the problem and that will solve the problem. We know that without also changing your culture and your process and really thinking and being intentional about how you're going to do that, you're simply not going to succeed. Not succeed on a large scale. You might be able to succeed on a project here or there or make some small incremental improvement, but frankly, incremental improvement is not enough. What we're seeing across the industry is that we really need to help and bring these customers and companies into a place where it's a full transformation. And in order to do that transformation, you really can't separate your culture and your tooling. Your culture enforces your tooling, which reinforces your culture, which reinforces your tooling and your process and your teams and the way that you work together. And really, to me, DevOps has always been about the way that people work together. It's not been about a tool.
Yeah, and this is sort of the thing that Adam talks about, sort of the chef style. Is it ninja?
The chef style DevOps kung fu.
Right. So that's almost like a culture. I don't want to say framework that you guys are talking to customers about, but it is. I mean, it's as much about sort of culture and process as it is technology.
Yeah, it absolutely is. When we look at DevOps, there's a really nice thing about DevOps. It's this banner term that many people are getting behind. It's picked up a lot of steam and focus over the last 6 years since the term was coined. However, with that comes a lot of misinformation, a lot of, frankly, vendors want to come in and sell you the DevOps tool. So you sprinkle the DevOps and all of your problems are solved. And we simply know that's not the case. So we've come up with this idea of a DevOps style Kung Fu. And the idea there is that, there are many different schools of Kung Fu. And when you see Kung Fu, you know Kung Fu. But you might not know the school of Kung Fu that it's from. So the DevOps style Kung Fu really looks at the principles that are kind of universal to everyone practicing DevOps. It looks at the forms that we practice on a regular basis. But then it also makes a big distinction between the sort of principles and forms down to the application. And the application is so unique within an individual or within an organization. And I think it's the uniqueness of this application of these principles and forms that make it so hard for people to define and agree on what DevOps is.
Right. Now, so you were sort of talking about it, right? Like DevOps, for the ones that have been around it for a long time, you sort of get it. But like you said, it's like everything else in our industry. Like, it becomes a little more mainstream. It sort of gets adopted by big vendors or by consultants or whatever. Cloud went through this whole thing. What does that mean? And like, one of the things I notice, and I'm kind of curious because you're out in front of people like all the time, whether you're engaging with an end customer or you're doing a meetup or something. Like, there's a part of DevOps that sort of embraces the whole like unicorns and sparkly rainbows and we're kind of unique, and then there's a part of it that there's a certain amount of sort of blowback coming from the industry of going like, oh, okay, if they're talking about that stuff, it must be bullshit. And like, how much do you feel like you've got to sort of be a showman about it and be like, I got to get your attention because this is different, but there's this really cool outcome that happens with it? And how much are you like, I got to kind of frame it in this, it's different thing. Walk through, I'm trying to figure out, like, does that drive you crazy, or is that stuff you kind of embrace because it's change, and change is, can be fun or it can be painful?
Right. So certainly from my personal perspective, for the most part, I absolutely embrace it. And here's kind of why I'll actually step away from DevOps for a second and talk about meetups. So I love to go to meetups. I've organized meetups for, 5 years or longer. So I've been to many, many meetups. But I do remember the first meetup that I went to. And I also recognize the look on people's face when I go to them and say, hey, what you should do is go to a meetup, especially if they've never been to a meetup before. And the look on their face is, I just asked you to go to work after you're done at work.
Yeah.
But what I want to do is go to family or go to pub or go to sport when I'm done with work. I don't want to go to more work. And it goes back to kind of what you said. It really is, you'll find this community of people that are so supportive and will help you with your education, will help you advance your career and your skill set. And so for me, yes, if you walk into corporate America or a large enterprise, you're unlikely to find people getting excited about unicorns and goats and sparkly DevOps princesses. But we really are changing and have to be sort of these change agents, and we want them to start thinking differently. Heck, if you look at some of the videos that I've made for Chef Comp, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's the DevOps on the farm video.
I was watching that one, yeah.
Like that is, it's a completely zany, crazy thing that is a juxtaposition of, if you watch it, it's ridiculous. If you listen to the words, they're all real. Like everything I'm saying there, maybe not everything. Most of the things I'm saying there are real things that you need to consider as you start adopting DevOps and changing the way you work.
Yeah. Yeah. How much do you find, one of the things I always find is, and it's not always so much DevOps, but when you're talking about, helping companies kind of modernize, I feel like sometimes we get a little carried away with everybody wants to talk about Uber and Netflix and Etsy and I get the sense sometimes that companies are like, I've heard that one before, or I don't feel like we're that kind of company. Like, do you find that as you engage with customers and clients and people in the meetup communities and stuff, like there's enough smaller examples that people can go, okay, cool, I don't have to relate to that huge one that, totally changed everything they did? Or are those still good, valid kind of examples because they are so big and people can go, okay, maybe I want to aspire to something bigger?
Yeah, I think that those definitely represent both things that are super awe-inspiring, but also super easy to say, you know what, that's not going to work here. That's not my company. Either I'm too large and too old, or that's just not the way we think. We're not ready to embrace all of that. And so I think that the things like Ducy's podcast, The Goat Farm, if you look at things like the DevOps Enterprise Summit, you can find out there that there are stories of large companies, slower moving companies that are embracing this change. And frankly, if you look at change across the IT industry, like how has our workflow changed, how have our processes changed, it does take a while, right? There are organizations that are slower to adopt the new changes. But I think that what I like to do is go and find those folks. If you look at, say, a Mark Schwartz from the U.S. Citizens and Immigration Services, they're doing really interesting things in the government. If the government can do it, we all can do it.
Right.
And I think it does, it takes the right approach. What you're not going to do is leave dinner tonight saying tomorrow we're going to be a DevOps company and we're going to follow all the DevOps practices. Everything's going to be continuously delivered in lean. And you come in the next day and that's how everything works. That obviously isn't going to happen. You have to, and I think that larger companies understand this, but you have to invest. You have to invest in your people. You have to invest in your process. And the net outcome is going to be something that is absolutely powerful and beneficial to you and your customers.
Yep. Yep. So we've talked a bunch about community so far. I want to touch on technology at least a little bit.
Yeah. For sure.
So let's talk a little about config management. So people know Chef, people know Puppet, they know those names. I have to imagine you guys get a little bit tired of people always kind of going, yeah, Chef or Puppet. It's sort of like, yeah, I'd like a Coke, or Diet Coke, or is Pepsi fine, that kind of thing. But what's really kind of going on? What's new in the industry? Because there's a part of it that's what you guys do, which is just block and tackle stuff, like document your code, get it into code repositories, automate as much as you can, and then there's stuff like Docker that's coming out, and people are kind of enamored with this idea that, hey, I can just put everything in a Docker file and I'll sort of eliminate the need for this stuff. Like, what's causing some of that, and what are some of the realities as you get into actual large deployments where maybe that mindset doesn't necessarily work, or it leaves some big gaps?
Yeah, sure. I think that the thing that's driving that is no surprise, really. This idea of containerization and Docker and all of that stuff. If you look at who it's really targeting, it's of huge benefit to the developer, the software engineer that's sitting down to build the application. And frankly, what the application developer cares most about is, I want to get this application built, and I want to get it shipped out. And so it's so easy with Docker or with containers to make that happen in a very fast way locally on your workstation, on your laptop. Yep. And then you can take that same container and push it all the way through to your production environment. If you look back at things like test-driven development, following that workflow, a developer does not want to sit and wait for integration tests to run, for an hour. Tests have to be very quick. Well, with a container, I can also spin up an environment super quick, sub-second time to spin up that environment. So I think that's really driving a lot of the popularity around that.
Yeah, and does that, from a chef perspective, does that change the way you guys think about what you do? I mean, is sort of going from machine-centric to, say container-centric, or, I mean, have things changed a lot from, machine-centric to VM-centric to container-centric, or not so much? I mean, it's still the same base principles and, best practices and so forth.
No, I think it's definitely changing. It's changing a lot of things. Look, when you went from a physical machine to a virtual machine, essentially, from an outside perspective, it's still just a physical machine, right? You have the full operating system and it runs as if it were a physical machine. And then the same thing with cloud instances. Yes, the deployment topology changes. The bits that you have to worry about, like when you move to the cloud, you no longer have to worry about how many ports do you have available in your network switch. That's someone else's concern. Yeah. You don't have to worry about that, right? But when you move to a container, frankly, there was some time when Docker first started, gaining popularity, where we were thinking about, well, how do you run Chef Client inside of that container? Which, of course, is the wrong way to look at a container. A container is not just a little. It's not just a little VM. It's something that's completely different. And so that does cause us to look at things much, much differently. One of the great benefits that we see in the Chef community around Docker is when you're testing your infrastructure as code. As I mentioned, it is super fast to spin up a Docker container. So what if I can start testing some of my Chef configurations, my Chef recipes, directly in a Docker container locally? It's certainly faster than spinning up a virtual machine locally. Yeah. But I think there are still a bunch of unknowns, a bunch of questions that we have to ask about containers. And I think that maybe not as much containers, but certainly with Docker. Of course, the container technology has been around for a long, long time. Right. Docker does make it so much easier, though, and the developer experience is so good. And that's really where I think you're seeing a lot of that adoption happen. Yep. But when it comes to getting Docker into production at a significant scale, there are definitely people out there doing it today. I would say they are much more on the cutting edge of that. There are still lots of questions that I think people have to really think about as they're moving to containers and as they're moving to Docker. Yep.
What about sort of if we said sort of state of infrastructure as code, it's getting much more understood from the sort of server infrastructure, if you will. But what about sort of the big iron boxes, the storage and networking stuff? Where is that in terms of like the stuff that's still a big box and then the stuff that's sort of becoming software defined? Like, is that software getting better in terms of exposing APIs that you guys can automate and stuff like that? Or are those teams starting to embrace some of this a little bit more?
Yeah, I think frankly what we're seeing is that the community is clamoring for those big box things, storage vendors, your networking hardware. As a community, we want we want an API to all of those. And so we are starting to see that happen across the community and across the industry. And it's being driven not only by us at Chef. Of course, we want to allow you to automate more things, but it's the customers going to folks like 3PAR or EMC or whatever and saying, what I want is an API into your application, into your box, so that I can manage that. And we find really interesting things in the Chef community is a great example. There's the F5 load balancer. And Target, of all places, Target released an open source cookbook to manage their F5 load balancers. So if you step back, 5 years, maybe not even that far, the idea of Target releasing open source software and that it being for a thing that's relatively complex, or certainly 5 years ago was relatively complex to automate, it's a pretty interesting thing, and it's a beautiful success story that I love to share with folks as well. Right.
Well, and I'll give a simple example. When I was at EMC, a couple of months ago, we had a product that did object storage, so it sort of emulated Amazon S3, and had an API. We really, like you said, we didn't do a whole lot as a company to go, oh, well, okay, let me put myself in the customer's perspective from an ops perspective. Like, we would sort of go like, hey, it's got an installer, so that's great. It'll be good to go. And hadn't really thought a ton about, okay, how do you manage it as infrastructure as code? I think we spent a week with some of your team that was like out in Seattle or Portland. I can't remember exactly where. The guys came in, banged it out, basically built us, a recipe that said, here's how you can deploy it. Here's how you can do upgrades or rolling upgrades. It's not a super complicated thing. So, I think the big thing is, like you said, customers are going to push for it. But a lot of it was just, when we were at a vendor, is basically not thinking about your thing as software that runs on a box, but thinking about it as like, it's just an application because now it just runs on an x86 machine. And if you think about it like an application, then, working with like the guys at Chef, like it's not hard to do because they do this stuff all the time.
Exactly. And that's a key thing, I think, also that you've touched on there. When we talk about infrastructure as code, it's key to remember that it's not automated infrastructure. It truly is infrastructure as code. And the fact that, the Chef framework and the Chef platform is built as a very open API and as a full programming language, it means that as we build out the platform, there's no way we can conceive of every problem that you're going to need to go and attack. But because of the way the platform is built, it does make it very easy, or relatively easy, to add those extensions, add additional libraries, and automate the things that in the past were not automatable.
Yeah. So we talked about a little bit at the beginning where we said, like, you were in your job, you were sort of, you had a big project to work on. You just, you became a sysadmin overnight, and then you sort of grew yourself into the job, and meetups helped and open source helped. Like, what if somebody comes up to you after one of the meetups, they come and listen to you talk, you showed some of the stuff you do with Chef, which if anybody gets a chance, go see Nathen present, because it's part of it's a show. It's fun. It keeps you updated, but it's very hands-on and stuff. Like, if you had somebody who came up to you and said, like, this was the first time I've seen this stuff, what should I do? Like, what should the first couple of things I do so that a month from now I'm better at this, or 6 months from now? Like, what's a good common answer you give those folks? Because I'm a little worried that this stuff is moving so fast. These new things are moving so fast that we're not going to have enough people that can get up to speed quick enough. So it's like, what are the first couple of steps people should take?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything moves so fast. In fact, I just held earlier today, I held a webinar for Chef about how do you engage with the community. And a large part of engaging with the community is how do you level up your Chef skills, or how do you learn about new technologies at all? And so some of the things that I always recommend, it doesn't really matter if it's Chef or another framework. It's likely that whoever's putting out that framework has put online some tutorials and some learning material. I would say that with Chef, always I recommend people start with learnchef.com or learn.chef.io. We have great hands-on tutorials there. Of course, there's documentation. I think the docs sometimes feel a lot more like a reference guide, which is kind of what they are, than about like a learning guide. And so going to a place that will help you learn, not just describe the system, that is of huge value.
Yeah.
I think just in order to stay on top of the latest technologies, I have a couple of words that I'd like to say there. The first thing you should do is pick a medium that you like, whether that's books or podcasts or meetups or some combination of all of those things, and dedicate some of your time to those things. I find, for me, podcasts are great. I listen to all kinds of podcasts. I love listening to them while I'm working out, while I'm riding in the car, commuting, cutting the grass. Like, all of these things are great times to have a podcast on and just be thinking about, what's next, what's coming up. But the thing I'll warn you against, though, is there's so much new and ever changing. You do not have to be on the cutting edge. It is good to keep your finger on the pulse and know what's coming, but you also have to think very, very clearly and very intentionally about what are the outcomes that you want within your organization or for your career, and make sure that you're working towards those and making progress every day towards those outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, because especially, I find too many people that I talk to go like, yeah, we listen to your podcast and a lot of that stuff sounds cool, but like we're multiple years behind that. So what can I do in the interim? So yeah, no, I think I would totally agree. It's, pick something that you're comfortable with, keep it simple, stick with it for a little while until you kind of get over the really awkward stage. So I'm gonna wrap this up before I ask folks where they can go stalk you and find out and stuff. I want you to sort of relive the little story that you told at the and I think you probably do it at a bunch of the DevOps meetups. But one of the things I get from people all the time is they go, Brian, all the stuff you guys talk about, whether it's automation or infrastructure as code as whatever, like I'm not a developer. And there's this sort of initial thing where they're like, oh crap, I can't participate in this because I don't have a computer science degree, or I'm not a developer. And like, tell the story you told about the whole, Aerosmith, Run DMC,
Sure.
Walk This Way thing about like, doing the role that you're supposed to do as opposed to becoming something that you don't necessarily think you are.
Absolutely. So the story started, actually, I was at a conference and I was talking to a developer. It was shortly after I joined Chef, and I mentioned that I had joined Chef, and the developer looked at me and he said, I won't say the word that he said, the expletive that he said, and then he followed that with hate DevOps. And when he said that, I looked at him funny, because to me, DevOps is a professional and cultural movement that's all about building high velocity organizations. How can you hate that? But I understood and understand that a lot of times when people say they hate DevOps, what they mean is, I don't like doing system things. I don't like running operations. I don't want to be a sysadmin. At the same time, I hear sysadmins saying, I don't want to write code. I'm not a coder. To which I usually remind them, like, look, if I show you a Bash script and an Apache configuration file, a Postgres configuration file, you're going to recognize every single one of those. Every single one of those has a component of code. So not only are you a developer, but you're a polyglot developer. So you are definitely a developer. But the story kind of, it was, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, I was watching a show on National Geographic, and it was called the 80s, the decade that made us. And I realized then that DevOps actually started in the 80s. And it started when Rick Rubin talked to Run DMC and talked to Aerosmith and said, what I think you guys should do is collaborate together on a song. And he told Run DMC, who was a rap band, to go and cover Aerosmith's Walk This Way. And of course, Aerosmith is a rock band. And back in the 80s, like, the two never met. It was always, here's the rockers, here's the rappers. Well, in the interview that I saw on television, Run DMC went into the studio and they put on Aerosmith's record, and they listened to it and they said, what is this? This is hillbilly bullcrap. I can't understand the lyrics. I don't even understand what they're saying. And to me, the sysadmin, the operations person in me lit up. I felt like a developer just handed me code and asked me to run it in production. And I looked at it and I said, this is hillbilly gibberish. I don't even know what to do. How should I run this in production? And then they cut to Steven Tyler, who was like, what are they doing to my song? They're totally destroying it, which to me kind of, I related that to a developer saying, hey, it works on my laptop. It works on my machine. Why can't you get it to run in the production environment? And then in the classic video, the two were on opposite sides of a literal wall. and they were both playing the music, and Aerosmith got mad because Run DMC's sound was bleeding through the wall. And so they in the video, they actually tore down the wall. And what happened was they came together on stage, but they didn't ask Run DMC to pick up a guitar and start being rockers. They didn't ask Steven Tyler to start rapping. They brought these two experts in their own field together, and they said, what we want you to do is not do each other's job. What we want you to do is make that audience happy. And to me, that's DevOps. We are well-connected specialists that come together under a common goal, and that common goal is to drive delight and success for our customers.
I like it. I like the story. The first time you told me, I went, yeah, that's it might date itself a little bit, but it's a great example of, you don't have to be the other person. You have to just be really good at what you do, and then you start figuring out where those collaboration points are. So
yeah, it absolutely does kind of date itself and date me for sure. But the other thing that I think kind of helps illustrate and drive home the point is that today we don't talk about rock bands and rap bands so much. Nope. There are so many crossover bands. Like in the future, we won't call it DevOps. We will call it IT, or probably what we will call it is business, and it will just be the way that business runs.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, very cool. Listen, man, I'm going to kind of wrap this up. Where can people stalk you, figure out where they can go meet you, buy you a beer, all that good stuff?
Sure. The best place to find out what I'm up to is probably on Twitter. And you can follow me on Twitter. You just have to misspell my first name just like my dad did. So on Twitter, I'm Nathen Harvey, and it's NathenHarvey on Twitter.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, listen, folks, before I wrap this up, I need to give a plug to a really good friend of the show. A lot of you guys know John Troyer, who for a long time ran the VMware communities. He's off doing his own thing now called Tech Reckoning. He's hosting an event that's coming up here in just a few weeks. If you're interested in signing up, it's going to be a really good community event. It's out in California, just outside of San Francisco. But go check it out. It's techreckoning.com. And if you use the Cloudcast as a coupon code, you get $100 off the administration or the registration fee. So if you're interested, if you're going to be out that way, go check it out. John runs a great event. It'll be lots of networking. So for Aaron and for Nathen, folks, thanks for listening tonight. Nathen, thanks for being on. Love all the experience. And like we said, go take a listen to his podcast as well. It's really good stuff. Folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up, and have a great night.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.